You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. My guest is Frantisek Baluska. He's at the Institute of Cellular and Molecular Biology, University of Bonn in Germany. So, Frantisek, thanks for coming.
Hello, Rich.
Yeah. So I see you're, primarily a botanist, but you're also, looking at the evolution of eukaryotic cells, and there's a whole bunch of things that you're looking at. So maybe give me a little bit of background. What are your scientific interests, and what are you working on right now?
Yes, so I started, in fact, as a plant physiologist, but from the beginning also I was a plant cell biologist. And the cell biology focus continued through the years, and later we started some projects on environmental responses in plants, especially roots, and firstly with gravity and later with light. And somehow also my focus in cell biology was deepened in direction to the evolution of eukaryotic cells. So in the end, I am now somewhere I could say I'm something in between of a plant physiologist, neurobiologist, and cell biologist.
Okay. So what fascinating or interesting things have you learned about plants, about their evolution in particular?
So with plants, I'm mostly focusing on the roots and especially on the root apex. And this root apex is really very fascinating structure and organ of the plant. Of course, the major function is to search a soil for water and mineral nutrients. And the soil is really very complicated environment, so the roots have very difficult task there. And of course, there is also very big danger. Sometimes there are dry areas or toxic areas, heavy metals, and so on. So the roots must be very clever in order to really find the nutrition. And for this, they also team up with the fungi, mycorrhiza fungi. And so from this point of view, the root apices are also very social. So not only the fungi, but also bacteria, are a lot of bacteria in the rhizosphere. So this is very social life there. And also we found out that the roots behavior is much more complex like it was predicted. So they really are solving big problems there underground.
Well, okay, so what are some examples of the complex behavior of the root system? What kinds of things is the complexity in how they interact with the microbes in the soil?
Yeah, they need to get to the right place, and this is very difficult in the soil. So they use very complex sensory systems which allow them to somehow navigate in this environment. And for this navigation, they also use something which we could call cognition, and this cognition is also based on some kind of a synaptic cell-cell adhesion domain. So it is very similar to what we have in our brains, in fact. And Charles Darwin with son Francis, they predicted this, in fact, already in 1880, the book Power of Movements in Plants, where the final paragraph is stating that the root apex is behaving as a brain-like structure, brain of lower animal. So they really solve these problems using very similar mechanisms and especially even molecules. So they have, for example, glutamate using as a transmitter, and they have a glutamate receptors which are very, very similar to our brain glutamate receptors. And we know more and more, then it is more closer and more closer. So the gap which was some 80 or 100 years ago between animals and plants, this gap is at the molecular level and cell biology level is narrowing. So they are getting closer and closer.
So, to be very simple, is the root apex is what? The root of the root?
The root apex anatomically is quite simple. They are also very clearly defined zones, which was in fact, I think, very important discovery in early 90s, where we found there is a zone which is in fact in between the meristematic zone where you have cell division and the elongation zone where the cell elongate very fastly. And in between, we found and described this zone, which we call transition zone, and this is the zone which seems to be fulfilling these neuronal aspects, so processing of information and also deciding which way to grow next, up, down, right, left. So the root is very flexible. And also, due to this zonation, there are two bending zones which are coordinated. So it means the root can move in a similar way, for example, like a snake or some worm. So we call it also worm-like crawling because they really use these two bending zones and to perform this very nice, very typical crawling movement.
What do you think? What kind of cognition is going on? Is it evaluating the chemical, gas gradients in soil, or what is it doing?
They're continually evaluating at least 20 parameters, but we are pretty sure there are more. So there are, for example, abiotic parameters like, of course, moisture, water, but also they need oxygen because if they don't have oxygen, they suffocate. And they also need to find mineral nutrients, very important, for example, phosphate or nitrate, which are absolutely essential for the plant. And so, of course, they are also having sensory events from the bacteria or the fungi, so they have some kind of a chemical communication with the fungi and bacteria. They have some friendly bacteria, but also some toxic ones, so they can really discriminate between them. Also, they attract these fungi, these mycorrhiza fungi, which are the symbiotic one, and these are very important in order to get more water and especially phosphate, because otherwise the phosphate is very difficult to find in soil.
So if I put a plant in, let's say, a pot of soil, and I put a source of nutrients, if I bury it in the soil in one spot, the root of the plant knows, it can sense it and seek it out, for example?
Of course, we don't know exactly from which distance it works, but we are still at the beginning of this. But they can really sense quite far distances, and also they have some social life with the roots of other plants. So they can recognize self, non-self root from the same plant or the same species, and they can also recognize plants from a different species. And then it depends. Some plants are friendly together, but some are really getting aggressive, and they can then release toxic substances to somehow kill the other plant. So the life is there quite complicated, and plants can be also quite nasty sometimes. So it is something which we still just start to understand. We are just at the very beginning of this very complex system there.
Well, who's doing the experimentation and what kind of experiments are being done?
There are really a huge group of scientists who are, for example, studying these roots mycorrhiza interactions, or now there are really very fanciful studies with the microbiome. So, like we have microbiome in our stomach, in our mouth, the root surface is really very rich, having very rich microbiome. And now there are many studies. I just opened today the Science, and you can find also a paper on the root microbiome there in the Science journal today. So these are now very fanciful studies, but of course these studies are not focusing on the cognitive abilities of the root. So this is still outside of the mainstream. So for this you will not get any projects. We are doing these studies mostly in some kind of a hobby-like fashion.
Well, what is your definition of cognition?
Cognition is difficult to, there are many definitions like with alive, but the most important issue is that we consider roots and the plant as a normal living, complete living organisms with everything together. So because currently in the mainstream, they still valid this some kind of a machine metaphor, and so the plants are considered, the roots are considered for some semi-autonomous or the semi-robotic structures which are having no cognition, no sentience, no knowledge about themselves, and outside life. But our point is that they have everything. So they have a real cognition, which means that they can understand what is going on around them. They need to be online all the time in order to be able to react properly, because these insults are coming from each second to second, and they are different insults. So the plant must immediately respond. And then also it is a problem of preferences. So the context is very important, how they respond. If they are not properly responding in the context, it is also then very bad for the root and for the plant. So they really need to solve all the time, continuously, many problems. And if they don't make the right decisions, then they will not survive.
What kind of stresses do plants are they observed to be reacting to in an intelligent way?
It is intelligent way, but in their own plant specific intelligence, because when that's the problem also with all these words and terms like cognition, consciousness, sentience, and intelligence. Mostly, we humans started this research from the most complex system, which is our brain and humans. But normally in science, you should start with the simplest system and then slowly progress to the more complex system in order to understand it properly. But we were doing the opposite. So we started with humans, and now all these words, which are in fact very general words, they are mostly reserved for humans. And if you try to use these words for other systems, then you are blamed that you are somehow mixing up, human business with the plant business. But it is not like that. So these are really very basic issues which are valid for the plant in the same way like for the humans or for bacteria. And strangely enough, with bacteria, mostly people are not so, negative when you say bacteria is solving problems, bacteria communicate together. Normally, this doesn't make such troubles like with the plants, which is very strange.
Well, again, what are some specific stresses that scientists have observed plants reacting to in what appears to be an intelligent way, or a way that requires cognition?
For example, it is not easy, to make even the experiments for this, because we study these plants mostly in the laboratories where the plants are kept in a relatively nice environment. So you would need to really go into the soil, and but it is very difficult to perform some experiment in soil. That's the big problem. But for example, you can find many examples how the plants can be even more intelligent as some kind of animals, like for example when the orchid plants are fooling, the pollinators, and they provide them with a perfect model of the female, and they try to copulate, and via copulation, of course, attempts they pollinate these orchids. So in this example, and there are many other examples, the plant is really having control about behavior of this insect.
Yeah, that's the weird thing, is how would these plants know what to look like?
This is a very big problem. So, in order to provide the model, and the model which is absolutely perfect, the plant must have some knowledge about this insect, and the plant must have somewhere, somehow, idea what to provide in order that this guy will just try to attempt to copulate. So they must have really very perfect model. So this is I think, something very puzzling. So where the plant is having this model, but I think it is inside of cells, like in our case with humans. So the brain cells, the neurons, are not so much different from the plant cells.
Yeah, I was
Sorry?
thinking about this. So this would mean that the plant would need cells that can take in light
Yes,
and see,
yes,
and literally see like we would
yes.
see.
I'm pretty sure they can see in a day again plant-specific way. In fact, some 100 years ago, some German professor was proposing this concept ocelli for plants, and in fact, the features of epidermis cells, leaf epidermis, but also other epidermis cells of plants, are fulfilling some criteria for ocelli. So they called it ocelli, and they should be, in fact, able to realize or recognize some features using these cells. And of course, another issue, they can also recognize the sound waves, so they can, in other words, hear. And who knows? I think the sensory capabilities are uh, underestimated, but they are enormous.
Yeah, because I was reading a book called Virolution, by Frank Ryan, and they talked about the hummingbird and the plant
Yes.
that it gets nectar from. And the plant that it gets nectar from, they said, the shape of the opening in the plant is just perfect for the hummingbird's beak to fit in it. How would two separate creatures evolve in order to be so perfectly matched? How could that happen?
Yes, another example are acacia trees and ants. These acacia trees, but there are also example of some other myrmecophile trees. They recruit some special ants, and they provide them very special food globuli. So when the ant starts to lick this globuli, this ant will stop to take any other food. They are completely addicted to this food globuli, and they provide them also shelter, which is having entering space perfectly fitting to this ant. So even other ants will not fit into this shelter. And these ants are then protecting the tree against pathogens, against some insects. They even attack big animals like giraffes or humans if they are trying to approach the tree. It seems that there is something which is making them addictive, and there is something also which makes them more aggressive. So they are extremely aggressive, and they also are addicted just to this food. So they are licking these food bodies, and they refuse even sugar if you give them. They refuse anything. So they are completely addicted to these food bodies which the acacia tree provided.
Wow.
So they are like servants, complete servants, and they are very, very aggressive because there is something inside, I think oxytocin or something, which is increasing their aggressivity also. So they are not afraid of anything.
That's crazy.
But there are many examples of this. Another example was published a few years ago that the tomato plants, which was overeaten by caterpillars, started to produce some chemicals, still not understood very well what these are, which makes the caterpillar starting to eating each other. So they induce cannibalism in caterpillars.
Yeah, there's plants that are psychoactive, that are hallucinogens.
They don't move, so they completely focus on chemicals, which manipulate the behavior of mostly animals or insects or so on.
Yeah, how would they do that? That's crazy.
This is what we need to find out, but they must be having really very rich mental life, but it is very difficult to first get money for this research, but also to study this because they are completely different organisms. So they are like from different planets, So we are still thinking about our human origins, and we are thinking with the human-animal brain, which is somehow not able to understood these plants. So they are even more complex like animals, I think. Even from the point of view of cells, because they also have not just mitochondria, but they have also these plastids, chloroplasts inside of the cells. So the complexity starts already at the cell level. They are much more complex.
Have we observed any short-term adaptations within the lifespan of a plant, that are surprising or shocking? Has that ever been observed?
I think they are adapting, in fact, all the time. So this is what they do. And also the phenotypes are mostly not just what we think about phenotype, the shape of the organ or leaves or roots, but the phenotype is the chemicals. So they all the time change the cocktail of chemicals, and these chemicals are enormous amount of the chemicals which they produce. You maybe heard the name secondary metabolites. This term was designed some 100 years ago when we didn't understand what for are these chemicals, but they are not secondary. They are in fact very primary chemicals, and they use all these chemicals also to survive, to adapt, but also to manipulate, the insects of animals. And they are interested that humans or insects or animals eat some parts of them, because then they can get control over these insects, animals, or humans. So this is how they get the control. So they get you eat them, and then you will get some cocktails of something which we still don't chemically understand completely what is everything there. Of course, we know what is toxic, what is healthy, something, but there are many other chemicals, and they make this mixture, this perfect cocktail, this proportion of these chemicals. So this is unbelievable complexity in the chemistry.
Yeah, that's like mind blowing. The plants, I guess, have at their command ways.
We think the command of the plant is in the root apex, and is this exactly what the Charles Darwin proposed with his son Francis in this book 1880, Power of Moving the Plant. So the root apex, and in fact, if you think about this, in this paragraph, last paragraph of the book, they wrote, it is not a brain-like, but it is placed on the anterior body of the plant. which is also another very, very important message. So because we still don't think about plants like having anterior posterior pole, but they have, and if they have a brain at the root tip, then it's very interesting to see that the sexual organ, the flowers, which these are sexual organs, are on the
Right.
opposite end. So this is like any other multicellular organisms. You never have sexual organs with the brain together. They are all the time on the opposite poles. So they are with the heads in the soil, in fact. And also the anterior pole is not just the brain, but it is also the organ of uptake of nutrients. And for the plant, the nutrient is really water and minerals. The photosynthesis is just a process which is running in their symbiotic plastic chloroplast. But for them, the food is really water and minerals. So they have really head with the brain and the mouth in soil, deep in soil. And what we see outside is just, the leaves which are performing this photosynthesis. It is some kind of support, because it provides them with this organic substances. And then we have at the very top the sexual organs, which of course are manipulating animals, insects, because they are not mobile and they need to spread their pollen around. So that's why they made these flowers so attractive to those insects and animals. And also, if you look at the evolution, when the flowering plants were evolving, the biodiversity was really exploding, because also these pollinators, there were insects, there were birds, there were some other animals. They also then exploded in numbers. So in fact, our biodiversity on this planet is based on these flowering plants, and they need to pollinate with help of these insects, birds, and humans, or other animals.
Wow. Is there any papers you've seen that are attempting to figure out the mechanism by which plants make their evaluation of animals or insects or anything?
I think what is interesting, if you see the plant, the structure of the organs. Of course, the root apex is the most active, but these root apices, they are very tiny, and there are many, many, many. But they are linked together and via this system of vascular strands. This is in fact system which was studied, and all the time until now we studied just for the purpose of transport of nutrients, water, minerals, or photosynthase. But it is also connected with very active cells from the point of view of bioelectricity and action potentials. And so there are many, many action potentials running from the shoot tip to the root tip and oppositely. For example, if a root tip is having problem with the water, no water around, and many root tips also having this trouble, they send the message to the leaves to close the stomata. And this happens very fastly in order to protect the water, because otherwise the plant would lose the water and that would be end. So these vascular systems, they are, I would say, in some other words, of course it is not completely right, but they are like nerves. They run throughout the whole plant body, and especially important is phloem, which is the part which is for transporting of photosynthase, because this is one cell, in fact, one huge cell, and this is extremely active in action potential. So it is some kind of a spine of the plant, I would say, connecting the whole all organ in one coherent system.
Is there any delay in signaling in very tall plants, like tall trees?
The technology is still not far good enough, and also the groups which are working on these topics is now almost minimum. But there are some disputes how fast are these action potentials in plants. Mostly agreement is that they are slower, like in animals or humans, but they are still fast enough, to transfer the message within some few seconds from the root tip to the shoot tip, even in big trees.
It's weird. You would think the research on plants would be very cheap and easy to do, and therefore a lot of it would be done, because people don't care about them.
That's true, but until now it is not the case, because generally in a mainstream science the plants are not cognitive. General feeling is they are just some kind of semi-robotic systems, stimulus response systems, which are not having all these abilities. So it is still not accepted by the mainstream, and that's pity.
So I guess you could say that plants are master chemists, and they're like chemical geniuses.
Yes. They are masters of chemistry, definitely. And they also use volatiles. Volatiles, they release the volatiles for many, many issues. So, for example, they can inform each other if there is some heavy, heavy attack. And because normally the immunity in plants is low, because immunity is very costly. If you have very high immunity in plants, you will not have any plant growth almost, because all energy goes to the immunity. So normally they have it down. But if there is some attack, they send around some chemicals, some volatiles, and they then all plants start to enhance the immunity. Or they can call so-called bodyguards, which are insects eating or killing the bad guys who are eating their leaves. So they have many, many possibilities how to protect even when they cannot move. So via chemistry. So the chemistry is for them everything.
What are some examples of plants suffering a tremendous attack and calling in for help or helping themselves, like doing coordinated reactions? What are some examples you've seen?
So there are many papers published around. This part of plant studies is running now, even without interpretation like cognition. So they release the chemicals which first can attract some enemies of these insects. So they can attract enemies which then kill these insects or which make them somehow bad issues. Or yes, these are called so-called bodyguards. So the plant bodyguards, if you give to the Google, you will find several papers on this, releasing chemicals which attract enemies of these caterpillars, for example. It's another insect, for example, mostly another insect which is putting eggs into these caterpillars and somehow getting them out of feeding on the leaves. They prevent them to feed on the leaves more. Or another example was this tomato plant I told you before that makes the caterpillars eating each other, so inducing cannibalism.
Oh, so the plant can say like, "Hey, there's caterpillars eating me! Alert, alert!" and they can put out something that tells other insects that there's caterpillars there. So the insects would come and eat them.
Yeah. They release some chemicals which attract enemies of these caterpillars, and mostly these are insects also.
Well, what about exposing plants to a creature they've never seen before that would want to eat them? Has that been done to see if they can adapt within minutes?
This could be a nice experiment to perform, but from their history they will just test several chemicals which if they work. So they will just make some experiments, I would say. They will just release some chemicals, and if they don't work, they try to adapt the chemistry of these chemicals in order to attract someone. I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they can understand what is there outside, but they can understand. And this is really a problem for the science, how to explain this ability.
But why not do an experiment where you have some plants in a room and you have sensors to sense gases that are coming off of them? Pick one that does this already. Like pick one that caterpillars like to eat, and the plant is attracting insects to kill them, and then maybe try a new creature. Have a dog try to eat it and see what chemicals get put out, or a person.
This part of research is now quite active, in fact, and there are many groups around the world who are doing these experiments. So this is now progressing quite well. But still, the huge complexity of these chemicals which are released is so huge and it is not easy to connect them to some signals. It's still mostly people think that the 90% or I don't know how much. Mostly of these chemicals are just released by no real value, and only few of them are used for signaling or attracting. But it is difficult to somehow to be sure. My guess is that most of these chemicals will have some function for the communication.
But essentially, plants that have evolved to work with other creatures.
They have something what you can call memory. They can even predict what will happen, so they expect already some situations. So this all is part of their cognition. So they have ability to store information, sensory information, to combine, process this information according to context, because this is very important. And also they can use this information later. So they really predict what will happen, and they're already preparing. And you can see this, for example, also during a year when the plant starts to somehow prepare for winter time. So this is one very obvious issue, but they can predict something which is regularly happening. They immediately can somehow start to predict that it will happen again.
How do you know they're predicting? What's an example of that?
It's difficult to explain to you now with this example, but again, as I told you, for example, they predict if the winter is coming. You know what is the according the amount of the light they get, according the temperatures. They know exactly when the winter will be there. You know, even without having any calendar, they know exactly
Also,
when
they're
the winter is.
evaluating trends and moving
They
averages.
evaluate every parameter in the environment. They evaluate every, and some of these parameters are for them very important. They make some priorities also. So something which is not so important is put later, lower on lower level. So they must have some working memory space somewhere also. But again, not easy to understand how this should work in plants.
Hmm. What about you said plants can communicate with other plants and I guess do we see that plants communicate with other types of plants or just with their own, species of plant?
No, they recognize themselves mostly on the level of roots, but I guess also it will be on the level of shoots and leaves via this bouquet of these volatiles which they release all the time. And it is still not researched properly, but we know that some plants can grow together very nicely and some no. So some of them uh, they have some preferences who should be the neighbor, and if it is not the one they like, they start to be nasty. They start to secrete from roots some toxic substances, and they can even release toxic substances from leaves. And these substances, for example, can have impact on stomata of nearby plants. So the plant
Hmm.
nearby who is under attack will be not able to use properly their stomata, and that's very bad for the plant. And I think also our habits to having, for example, fields with a huge amount of corn plants or other these crop plants. I think we also somehow stimulate some kind of sociality with these plants, maybe. So they recognize each other very very precisely. And again, on the level of for example, if the wind is blowing and the leaves from the nearby plant are touching each other, they recognize this as a touch of the nearby plant, and they even can send messages then to the root to inform the root that here, I don't know, 20 centimeters is another. But the roots also know this because they are growing together in the soil, and they know exactly which roots I'm somehow meeting in the soil. They immediately recognize self, non-self, or if it is a kin, a non-kin root. So, and they also then change their behavior because there is also competition in soil for the space, and this is the same like
Mhm.
in with the shoots. They also fight for the light. So it is normally if the plants are growing in the dense canopies, they are fighting for the light also in the above ground, and they're fighting for the space in the roots. So that's why it is important for them to know if this is the plant from the same species or not.
Any examples of plant cooperation within the same species? If you have a field of
Well, I'm not
different
expert
plants.
on this, so maybe I cannot give you now a really good example. I just know, for example, in Africa, because in Africa they don't grow, this, for example, corn in big fields, and they use
Right.
mostly two, three plants together, which can very nicely somehow cooperate. So I forgot the name of the plants in Africa they use for to grow them with the corn, but there are some two, three plants which then
Hmm.
somehow give a better, result for them. And maybe this
Wow.
would be a good idea more even for other world, because I think how we grow these plants, and because this is mostly just because of the how to harvest them, how to harvest them in a easy way with the mechanisms and so on. But maybe it is not so good for the nature and for the climate, maybe. But who knows? I don't know.
Huh. I guess there's so many experiments that need to be done.
Yes, yes, of course, and it should be more supported and it should be more open-minded. But until now, it's still not the case. So it's a pity.
Yeah, I was imagining what if you're harvesting a field, let's say of corn, with let's say it's a big field of corn and you start harvesting. By the time you get to the end of the field, I wonder if those plants have gotten messages from the other ones that they're being chopped up and they change their chemistry. The
This
corn
can
was
happen, but mostly when if they are still in vegetation time, then it is not good. But mostly, these are 1 year crops which are then somehow harvested at the end of vegetation period, and it is okay. That's why it also works, with these plants, because if you would harm them during the middle time of vegetation, they would certainly start to fight back.
Are there times when the plant is more defensive than others? Like, let's say, like you said, in the vegetative state versus the the flowering or the fruiting stage, is there different behavior that's been seen in response to threats?
Yes, for example, for fruiting, this fruiting is also very interesting because this is the only example where the plant is growing some part of the plant organ fruit, which is destined to be eaten alive. This is the strategy how to distribute the seeds with flowering plants, so they generate the whole organ to be eaten alive. And interestingly, these fruits, when it is mature, is full of ethylene, which is a stress hormone, originally or typically studied as a stress hormone. But ethylene is also anesthetics, and it was used even in medicine some 120 years ago, even in U.S., and it was a perfect anesthetic. But there were some accidents because it is flammable, and if you don't make a good mixture with oxygen, then it can be you can have some accidents. What happened, and then it was stopped to use. But ethylene is a perfect anesthetic, and it might be because the plants are producing ethylene anytime they are wounded or under heavy stress. And in fruits, it is used during maturation. When the fruit is immature, there is still not high concentration of ethylene there. And you can even induce maturing of fruits using ethylene from outside. This is how now even companies are doing this, So they transport immature fruits and then they're maturating in somewhere in halls with the ethylene. So the ethylene is a fruit maturating signal, but it is again anesthetics also.
When you harvest a plant, how long? I guess we would think as soon as we harvest the plant, it's dead. But is there any evidence that the plant is still alive and still able to adapt and do anything?
Of course, if you have an apple harvested, I don't know, you can have it 2 months in your room and it is still apple, and if you bite it, it is still full of juice. So it is a living cells are inside. If it would be not living, then the apple would be rotten completely. So it is these fruits are really designed in a way that they, even after they are removed from the plant, they are still tasty and alive.
I wonder what their abilities are at that point.
So somehow I don't know. No one knows how it is. Why the fruit can survive so long. Even 1 year you can keep it somewhere in a nice place, and it is still okay. So there must be something inside. Again, some chemistry, which we still don't know, that it still can be alive, even if it is not connected to the mother plant. But again, what is interesting in connection to stress is this ethylene. That ethylene is produced not just in roots, in any plant, part of the plant. If you make a wounding or you cut the plant, ethylene is immediately synthesized in a large amount locally. So it is a local, I would say, anesthetics for the plant. And they also produce ether, divinyl ether, which is another anesthetics when they are stressed. So it seems that they can provide themselves with the anesthetics when they need it. And they also have many pain-killing substances, chemistry, which we humans are isolating as a painkillers then and using in medicine. But of course the plants are, I think, not designing these chemicals for humans, but they just, I think they use it also for their problems. And they're also sensitive to anesthetics. This is another issue when you apply another anesthetics, for example, completely unknown to the plant, like xenon. Xenon is a noble gas used in also surgeries, and we use xenon to the plant, and it is getting immobilized. For example, if you use plant like a carnivorous plants or mimosa, they cannot respond to your stimuli anymore under anesthesia with xenon. which means that even xenon, which they never met in their evolution, they never met to xenon in such large concentrations, but they are immobilized with the xenon like any other animals or humans.
Well, it seems like plants have interacted pretty closely with hummingbirds and ants and caterpillars. I mean, is there any example of plants interacting with humans in any significant
Yes.
way?
Yeah, this is our crop plants. I think the humanity, in fact, our civilization started, the developed civilization some 10,000 years when we started to use our crop plants. Of course, in our terminology, we domesticated the plants, but I think in a true sense, it is not domestication, it is a co-evolution. So we entered into co-evolution with these plants. And it was subconscious. We of course we still, or most people will say, okay, we domesticated crop plants like maize or corn, but without the changes from other side, without the plants also adapting to humans, this would never happen. Of course, we think it is because we selected some features and we then somehow guided the evolution of the crop plant. But in true science, this is a co-evolution between two different organisms. It is not much difference, like for example, the co-evolution between colibris and some flowers, or between ants and these trees, which keep them. So it is a real co-evolution. And when we entered this co-evolution, we were able somehow to build up our civilization because we were having much more food like before. So we could start to make cities and start to make some high civilization. But this started only after we started to co-evolve with these crop plants. And these are few plants. There are just, I think, 6 or 7 very crucial crop plants on which our civilization and the co-evolution is resting. Interestingly, there are also some weeds which try to look like a crop plant. This is so-called Vavilovian mimicry, and it's also very interesting feature, again, with the model, because these weeds, somehow they recognize this other plant is a crop plant for these guys here, and I would also like to be a crop plant, so they start to look like a crop plant, the weeds, even without having a good seeds and so on, but they look exactly like these crop plants, and this is called Vavilovian mimicry because Vavilov was a Russian scientist who discovered this very, very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, I think Michael Pollan, the famous author, talked about this.
This is, I think, the plant perspective. So you can see the whole process from the human perspective, but you can also go and try to see this from the plant perspective. But again, I think it is not domestication. For me, it is a co-evolution. And we are coming to the point where, for example, corn is not able to survive without humans. And I guess our civilization would be also not able to survive in present complexity without corn. So it is really, we are now dependent on each other. And this is a very tight coevolution. But coevolution is, for example, also between the plant's roots and the mycorrhiza. So the mycorrhiza fungi are so specialized they cannot survive without plants. They even don't grow when they don't feel any root in the neighborhood. So because they cannot live without roots, they cannot. They are absolutely dependent. So when the coevolution is very long, then these two organisms are somehow dependent on each other.
That's crazy. It's amazing. So what are you working on right now? What's your current research?
We are now focusing a little bit on the light, and we already discussed this briefly, this ocelli. And we have found that the root apex also is having this ocelli and is able somehow to have some rudimentary vision. We still don't know how this vision is, how powerful, but, in the soil there is mostly dark. It's a very dark area. So you would expect there are no photoreceptors, but opposite is the case. So we know that in roots all the photoreceptors of plants are expressed, and the one which is the photo1, which is the blue light receptor photoreceptor, is perfectly distributed in a way how you would expect it if the ocelli should be working. And we also provided the roots, with the darkness, because normally in laboratories the roots are grown in light. They grow very nicely, and when the people scientists started to use Arabidopsis, they use transparent petri dishes because the roots are, and also seedlings are growing nicely. But we know now, and our results showed that the roots under light are in stress modus, and they grow faster because they would like to escape from the light. So that's the issue. And here you can see the difference between plant physiology perspective and plant neurobiology perspective. Plant physiology perspective is okay. These roots are growing fastly. They are very long. They are in optimal situation. And the plant neurobiology say no, they are not optimal. They would like to escape from the light. They grow faster because they would like to escape. So you have the same result and a completely different interpretation.
Maybe what plant roots, maybe they have photoreceptors because they can sense the gradient of light that comes through the soil, so they know to grow downwards and outwards instead of upwards towards the light.
Exactly. They use these gradients in order to grow downwards. So they use the gradient of the gravity, but also of the light, to be placed properly in the soil. But if you put too much light on them, they are growing faster, but not because they are happy with the light. The opposite is the case. They would like to escape from the light, and they do any means to escape from the light. Because the photoreceptors are too sensitive, so they are more sensitive like in shoots. And that's why if you would be getting into a room with a huge light, you would be also blinded by the light, So this is what happens with them. The receptors are too sensitive for this light what we have here, but they are perfectly optimized for the light which is very low in the soil. But why they need this photoreceptor in all of them is very strange. So they have all of them, at least in Arabidopsis, because in this plant we know all the photoreceptors. And there is also one photoreceptor which is only in the root apex and not in the other plant organs. It's a UVB receptor. So this is our focus now. We try to understand these photoreceptors and these ocelli in roots, and also we are continuing our research a little bit now with the anesthetics, because I think the point with anesthetics can be very important even for the medicine in designing a new anesthetics which are not having side effects, because now most of the anesthetics are still having quite bad side effects, and plants can be used even for this research. But also, on the other hand, it is interesting to study these anesthetics on plants from the point of view how their cognition and how their consciousness is functioning. What is the molecular basis or structural basis of the consciousness?
Yeah, this is crazy. It's amazing. Really amazing. Oh, very good. Is there any other? We've been talking for a while here. Is there any other aspects of plants that you would like to see studied that aren't being studied right now?
I think what would be very important is that somehow the understanding of plants is really improving also from this point of view of plant cognition and plant behavior. In fact, we initiated a society, I forgot to mention, in 2005, which was called Plant Neurobiology Society, and we were having several symposia, but then there was a problem to, get young people there because they were in danger. The career was in danger when they joined our conferences, which is very strange. So we then renamed the society to Plant Signaling and Behavior. And I also am running a journal, our society is running a journal, Plant Signaling and Behavior, since 2006 already. And also I can tell you that, for example, word behavior, plant behavior is now accepted even by the mainstream. But at the time, 2006, it was not. So I think there is some slow progress, but very slow.
Okay. Well, very good. So what are, do you have any books or publications people can read? Like, how can people learn more about this?
Yes, I'm having several papers. If you go to my website, you can see also a list of my papers. I am also running these journals. Another journal is Communicative Integrative Biology, also with Taylor and Francis, which is having a little bit more general scope. And then I'm running a book series in the Springer Verlag, which is called Plant Communication. And there are some 33 books now already out since 2009.
Wow.
I can send you the link to my website, and then you can see links also to the society, to the book series, and also to my papers.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd like to put that in the podcast. That would be great if you send that. Yeah.
Yes. I send you all the links also to the society. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Frantisek, thanks for coming. This has been amazingly interesting.
Thank you, Rich, for calling, and I was really enjoying it also.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.